we go. Cool. All right, so what I want to do, this is a short class. This is just an hour class. It's an intro to caching, which we're going to focus mainly on what's called fragment caching, or low-level caching is kind of what we'll be taking a look at today. And I'd encourage y'all, if y'all have extra time or if you want to implement this into your project, to do things such as like page caching or action caching or anything else, any other types of techniques that you might see. You are more than welcome to kind of take a look into those docs. The Rails docs for caching is pretty great. I actually have it up here right now. And I think it's like linked in the lesson plan. But yeah, so my plan for the lesson today is I want to run through just like what caching is, give some examples, and then hopefully, I feel like I'm being ambitious for this hour, hopefully get you all to try this out on your own. That's like my main goal, because I feel like if it were me, I don't really learn much by just like watching someone all the time. So I want y'all to try it on your own at some point. So that said, I know y'all are coming off of a lesson and you haven't had a break recently. So I just want to run through quick warm-up chat, and then I'll give you a little break. So intro to caching. I think up until now, what we can kind of build off of our knowledge when it comes to caching is we've used memoization before. I don't think that we've ever had like a specific class on memoization, but it's something that we've implemented and we've used to be able to save a method's return value as to avoid recalculating that value throughout the length of that request.
Sorry, Meg.
You're totally fine. And I don't know that we've actually talked about that when it comes to memoization, but something like in this Congress tracker that we're using for today's class, and you all just came off of using a different branch of this, but with the authentication, when we had logging in a current user and also recognizing if someone was logged in, we use memoization here. But this memoization, like this at current user, this doesn't stay stored throughout multiple requests. It's only saved into that, or in this return value, and in this case, in this instance variable, for the length of that request. So with memoization, value stored of that return value, and it stays there. You can access it. In this case, like in our application right now for Congress Tracker, I think we're using it multiple places, but anytime that we try to go to this index, we're always checking to see if someone's a current user. So we decided to make it memoized because the likelihood of us trying to like filter whether or not what views are seen based off of a current user is pretty likely that we'll do that more than once within one request. So that's why we have it memoized. But that value that's stored in this like at current user, or at least the return value also for this current user, the value that is in there, it goes away as soon as the request is done. So now that kind of like brings us to caching, which is new topic for us to talk about. Some of y'all may have looked into it already. But with caching, the idea there is we're saving copies of files or copies of data for frequently used, or I'll say like expensive calls. So does anyone, can I get a volunteer? What do I mean by expensive calls? You can raise your hand. Joey.
I would say a call that's either going to an external API that might have a limited response, or something that takes like a lot of computing power, but the response would be the same always. Or,
yeah.
Or at least temporarily will be the same.
Right, it would infrequently change. Yeah, I like that. I think that we can think of expensive as both time and money, right? When we think of expensive, we think of money right away, but also time is money also. And you can even think like, how often do you go to a website? It takes 2 seconds to load and you immediately hop off of it. So we want to make things quick. So with caching, it allows us to store those files, store that data, to be able to retrieve that information a lot quicker. I think the example, I put this example here too, for just a metaphor, but in the lesson plan, it talks about this example of like a phone book versus a personal address book. So like if anyone used uses phone books, or at least knows how a phone book works, had addresses, had phone numbers in it, and this like huge book, right? So like I have a huge book here, and if I want to look up anything, I have to turn through the pages to be able to find what I'm looking for. But at least for me, I can remember like my mom's address book that we would always use. I remember like the exact color and what it looked like, but I could go to that address book that had like a collection of the most, or like our personal contacts, the people that I contact the most, or like need to look up their address most frequently. So that example of like we have one big phone book, and then we have like our own, so many books here. We have like our own address book. This address book is a lot quicker lookup, although it might have the same data that's in here. It's going to be a lot quicker lookup to use my own personal address book. So that's kind of like what we're thinking about with caching. I also use this example of like grocery store versus convenience store. Like I could go ahead and drive 15 minutes away to a grocery store, and that costs time, that costs extra money and gas. And I also could go to a convenience store that might be right down the corner from me. And that convenience store has a lot of goods that are like very commonly purchased goods. And so I can go to that convenience store to be able to get the most frequently bought, most frequently run out of goods, milk, bread, whatever, instead of going all the way to the grocery store. I think of memoization as like using this phone book as an example still, like if you had tabs on there, and this is also the examples in the lesson plan, but like, and actually now I'm thinking of like a different example, but yeah, like if you were to, let's say you wanted to find me in the phone book, and so you know that my last name starts with S, so you're going to go to the S section, which you can grab that like subsection of data to iterate through. So different return value, you can do whatever you want with that return value. It's stored in that like little subset for the time being. I also think of like, I just thought of this now, but when I was interning, I had a different notebook per mod. And so it was like, okay, I have all of these notes, but if I like grab the specific notebook, if I'm like, oh, I wanna remember caching. I want to take a look at my notes from caching. I can go ahead and grab the specific mod 3 notebook. So that's available to me, and I can iterate through this to see what's available. Jahara?
So you just brought up the grocery store versus the convenience store. And in my mind, I literally, like, being the mom in me was like, man, if I go to the grocery store, milk is like $5. But if I go to the convenience store, milk is like $9.99. So like
Probably
there's
not
a
the best
trade-off that happens there. But the question that made me think of is, with caching, is there also a negative trade-off or something that you're giving up in order to have that convenience, or is there no downside?
There's definitely downsides to probably everything. Let me open that up to everyone else. What do you think a downside of caching is? There definitely are some. Alexander, what do you think?
I think, like, in the case of calling on an API, you cache it, and instead of calling the API again, 5 minutes later, the cache could be out of date compared to the API.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest downfalls of caching is, and that's kind of why I put this like, here are some things to consider. Like, how often will that data that you are either caching or memoizing, how often will it be updated? So I think I'm kind of thinking of this in terms of caching, but like if I have a resource that I'm trying to, or like data that I'm trying to cache, is it likely that that is going to get updated frequently enough that it wouldn't serve me well to keep storing that in my cache? So I think there's kind of like the downside and the consideration that needs to happen. Alexander, thanks for bringing that up. Andrew?
I was going to suggest that one problem with caching might be like if you put information in the cache, and then something goes wrong with the cache, and suddenly you can't access the information. So now you have to make sure two things are working, or normal stuff in your cache.
Yeah, you would definitely need to have some rules around like when that cache, and we'll kind of talk about invalidating cache a little bit today. But you will definitely have to have some rules with caching that helps you manually invalidate those stored values. Rails does a good job with invalidating things for you, but there will be times when, like, for example, if you are caching something that uses a helper method, and if you were to change that helper method, then you also need to invalidate the original cache. So they're all things to consider. Jahar, does that kind of answer question? Bring up any other questions?
No, I think it's all it's all a trade-off, and I think the point that Alexander made was something that I probably should have caught quicker, and it made me think about like VCR and making some of the tests, like with the API calls that we've been making. And so like you make a VCR for one thing and you're like, my test is great, and then you either update something or change something or need to go redo it, and then that cassette is out of date, and then it's like that breaks everything. So I can see like the cache doing the same thing.
Yeah,
so.
That's a great example. Thanks for saying that too. Cool. Any other thoughts pop up just in reviewing caching and memoization? Any other questions that immediately pop up? All right, let's take a break. Let's come back at 21. See y'all at 21. Great. I put this slide right here, kind of goes over just very briefly the types of caching techniques that the Rails docs go over. Today, I'm just gonna kind of skip over this slide. Just want to let y'all know that, and I'm not doing this on purpose, or I am doing this on purpose, because I want to focus mainly on this fragment caching. Y'all are more than welcome to go back and take a look at page in action. There are some gems that you need to install in order to get these working. But we're going to take a look at fragment caching first. My dog's having like a little fit right now, so if you hear him. Cool. So fragment caching is specifically used for caching different parts of your application. And this is especially useful when you don't necessarily need to cache the whole view, or in the case of like low level caching, you don't necessarily need to cache like all of the API calls that are happening, or whatever queries that are happening. And maybe even like you want certain cached data to expire at different times. So having fragment caching allows you to assign different values to different cache, or different values that you're storing in the cache. So let's just jump into this and kind of go through some examples. And I want to look at, let's just do one of these views. Oh, let me show you first just like what I changed in this repo if you haven't looked. I made these like very ugly action routes, but just so that we can have separate views for this. So yeah, the only thing that I really changed is just like the naming of the actions here for the sake of this lesson. So let's go ahead. Let's do this view. So this view is for house members by state, just to kind of like review, even though I know y'all took a look at this morning. Let's go ahead and just look at this real quick. So I'm going to take a look at the view that we have rendered to us when we search by state. So this one here. And what I'm going to try to do is cache the results that I get for the house members for that particular state. So looking at that view, I'm going to type some things out here and then kind of go back and explain what I'm doing. So here's where I'm like iterating through all of my members and printing them to the screen. So I'm going to say, let me cache this part here. So for Rails syntax, cache, and then I put a name of the cache right after this. So I can do like, usually it's common to attach it to an object. So I'm going to start with that. Cache members do. Let's put an N down here. Cool. And put a pry. All right. So what this cache do does, this block right here, is actually, you know, I think this would be, I can explain this better when we actually see what gets stored into the cache. So let me actually run this again, or just at least hit my pry by searching for Alabama house members. So I can see I hit my pry. And to look at my cache, I can call rails.cache to get access to the cache. And then there's this method that we can use called instance variable get, which this is what you need to pass. It's not specific to something that you have defined. This at data isn't specific to anything. It is just grabbing all of the data from the cache. So when I take a look at this, again, I'm hitting this pry right here. I can see what got stored in my cache. Let's do it one more time. There we go. Okay, so taking a look at this value that I get back from data, this object here, one of my cache values that I have, it has the key of this giant string, and then the value has the content of the block. So whatever this block evaluated to, it got stored into that key that was defined by this at members. So at members is a collection of members, which are just plain old Ruby objects in our case right now. And so, or house member objects. So we can see, like when we take a look at this naming from the view, we have the path in which that cache took place. This right here is a hash of the data that's getting cached. So it's, I think it's using MD5 as the hashing or the digest that it's using for this. But essentially what it's doing is it's taking the content that was evaluated from this block and it's hashing it. And this is how it's being stored. So if I were to change anything in here within this block, this hash would change. It's specific to the content that's within the block. And then after that is whatever I named my cache. In this case, I named it at members, which is just a bunch of member objects. This might not be the best way to name it. It's definitely very unique, but this will cause some problems, and we'll see that in a second here. So what do I want to do? Let's do this. Let me actually exit out of here. And let me run it one more time. So again, searching for Alabama house members. If we search by state, I hit my pry over here. And if I take a look at the data that's in my cache, I can see my original one here. And then I also see another one that got generated. So what this cache do block does is it looks for a key in your cache that matches this name here, this at members. And if it can find it, then it should use that cache. It won't even enter this block. If it can't find it, then it will go ahead and create a new key value pair within your cache. So we can see that it created two cache values. We have two key value pairs from the 2 times that we called to find the house members. Why am I not, any ideas why this is not using the one that I originally created when I first hit that page for Alabama house members? Again, it's looking for a key that matches the name generated by this at members. You'll see any differences in this. We can even see like these numbers are the same. It's using the same path. The number, this hash here is the same because it's the same data within the block. All right, I'm gonna spill what it is. Since these are just PORO objects, they're gonna change the IDs every single time. So they're not specific. We don't have them stored in the database. So those hexadecimal values that are stored for the ID for these members, that's going to change every time. So that to say, we have to be careful with naming our cache. We want to make sure it's not, in this case, it's like a little bit too specific. These house members are going to continue to change with the PORO being created each time. So, and then we also want to make sure that it's not like too generic either. So like if I were to name this just house members, let me go ahead in here and I'm just gonna clear my cache. Exit out of here. And go ahead and search by state again. I hit my pry. If I take a look at my data, I can see that I have, you can see how this name changed just to house members. So taking a look back here, I see all of the results for Alabama, Jerry Carl, Barrymore. If I go back and I try to go to, let's say Colorado this time, search by state, I'm going to hit that pry. If I take a look again at my cache data, I still see that I just have that one cache, which like, okay, that's kind of what we were looking for us to not keep repeating this. But the issue here, let's take a look now after I exit this, is I'm still getting Jerry Carl Barrymore. I'm still getting that value that I cached from when I first went to Alabama house members. So we don't want to be too vague. We want to make sure that we're naming the cache specific to the view that we want it to render, or we want it to pull from our cache. So we do have access to this like at state variable up here, and that should help me better define, let's actually do house members, this cache name. I can get rid of my cache just by stopping my server and starting again. So I'm going to do that. Clear my cache. Okay. We still have our pry here. You know what I'm also going to do? I'm going to put a pry in here just so we can see when we hit the cache and when we don't. So running the pry. Cool. So just looking at this before even playing around with it on localhost, we should hit this pry the very first time we go to a state's house members page. The second time that we go to that state's house members page, we should not hit that pry. We'll still hit this one because it's down here, but we shouldn't hit the one that's inside of the house members. So actually, you know what? Let me take this one out so that we can just see that. We should hit it the very first time. The second time we go to that page, we shouldn't hit it. If we go to another state, we should see updated data for that specific state. If we go to that state again, it shouldn't hit the pry. So cool, leaving that as is. Good. Let's go ahead back here. Let's go to main. Search by state, I hit my pry. We can see I'm within this cache block. Currently, there's not going to be anything in my cache because I haven't finished defining or like going through the data within this cache block. But I'm going to go ahead and exit out of there. I can see the two house members from main. If I go back and search for main again, I don't hit my pry, and I still see those house members from main. Now, the issue before with it not being uniquely named was that Chelly and Jared would appear on any house member list from whichever state. So the way that we went about fixing that was making it specific for that specific state. So let's go to a different one. Let's go to Louisiana. Search by state, we hit our pry. Take a look, we can see we're in this pry. If I exit out, I can see the house members from Louisiana. If I go back and search again for Louisiana, I don't hit my pry. If I go back to Maine, still not hitting my pry. Everything has been cached. So this is an example of fragment caching within your view. You can also add in the docs, you can take a look at this a little bit more, but let me just scroll up so we can see this. You can see like there are a few values here within the value of the cache key. A lot of words right there. But this expires at, we didn't set, we could put it in here as like a, I think it's expires in 12 days. Sure. And let me pull this down just so we can take a look at the cache a little better. Cool. So let's try and go to house member page for main. I had cleared my cache. I stopped my server, restarted it. That's why it's hitting this. Also because it's out of the cache block. What was I just about to do? Oh yeah, let's take a look at the actual data. We can see that the expires at was updated. So you can play around with those flags that are on there. Once this does expire, it will, let's actually do this. Let's say it expires in 15 seconds. It will go ahead and invalidate the last cache for that specific name that we have here, and it will overwrite it with a new one. So let's go ahead, exit out, and just see this in action really quick. Let me actually just start and stop again too. Just so we have a fresh cache to go off of. All right, so main, search by state, we hit our pry right here. I'm gonna exit out and refresh, or actually search by state again. I don't hit it. Oops, I'm gonna keep refreshing. 15 seconds feels like a lot when you're just waiting for something to happen. Oh, here we go, hit my pry. So after 15 seconds, it's saying, oh, I can't use this cached value anymore, and I need to redefine it. We put a pry down here, just so we can see it. Exit out. Oh, it's not gonna hit that. But yeah, it did go ahead and redefine that. Joey, question.
Two questions. The first one, when we first defined the cache to be at members, I understand why that was like a bad idea, but if we had not been passing poros and had been passing like database objects where the IDs were consistent, would something like that work? Because the poro object IDs would be static based on the ID of the database record.
Yeah, that would actually be ideal to be able to cache on a specific object from your database, because Rails actually has, what's actually happening with Rails is if it's an object, let's say it's a user, that's the only thing we have, and I can't really use that as an example because we don't have anything other than current user in this app. But let's say I was caching on an @user, and that was an object in our database. If that object ever got updated, if that ever changed, like if we ever changed, I don't know, any aspect, any attribute from that user, then that updated stamp would get changed. And as soon as we get to that part in the code that is going to evaluate that cache do block, it's going to see that that object has a new updated and it will invalidate the old one and go through that block again. So if you can use an object, use an object.
Gotcha. And then second question, is the cache local or is it stored on the server?
Server.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're storing this on, and that's specific to Rails. A lot of other frameworks will do it similarly. And to be honest, like that's how I've done it. I haven't really worked much with client-side caching. If you think about, like, at least from my point of view, like, we want this to persist no matter which user is using it. Like if we are making those API calls, we don't need to make a new call for every single user that tries to access our application. We can store that on our side so that we have a cached version of it for any user.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Thanks. Ryan?
Yeah. So as far as understanding from a front end versus a back end developer perspective, kind of going to this idea that we want to be really, really good back end developers, but maybe we have the knowledge of the front end. To me, it seems like memoization is like a back end skill. Is caching at the same level skill? Are the people that are masters of the front end, are they really good at is caching like their thing compared to like memoization being the back end thing?
I don't know that it's necessarily their thing. I think caching can be used regardless of front end or back end pretty equally. I think like when we think about the front end, we might want to cache like in our case right now, we're caching view data, and that's like HTML, whatever assets are needed to be compiled. But the important part like that I see with caching, especially server side that we're doing with Rails, is we can use it for those expensive API calls, for calls that might not frequently change, and we can save that on our side. So I wouldn't say it's like one end or another. I think the way that you do it is a little differently. That said, I think it is good to communicate through your documentation like what you cache and how often you expire it, so that if a front end is using your back end, they know what data might be stale, could be stale.
So caching could apply to like the JSON serializer route just as well as it could like a HTML view? Or would that only be memoization?
I see what you're saying. So okay, let's think. With building an API, that's what you're talking about with like a serializer.
Right.
It would, I mean, I think it would only be useful for like a get. Like if you wanted to get data from that API, I think that would be okay to cache. But if you're using like a post or an update, you wouldn't want to cache that because that will be different each time.
Gotcha.
You can still use it with a serializer, but I would say specific to like a get route. Cool. Let's go through one more example, and then I'll put you all into a practice session. So the other thing that I mentioned I want to talk about, this is an example of like our fragment caching with our view. And Ryan, I feel like you always have a good way of like segueing us into the next part. I feel like this happens quite frequently. But taking a look also at like, okay, on our backend side, in our current app right now, let's take a look at the controller. What is this, Congress controller? We have these two actions, which look up different things from our ProPublica API. I'm going to leave this one for you to do. Yeah. And I want to talk through like, okay, well, what if we want to cache a request that's being made? Maybe this is like a really expensive call that we're making with this member by last name. And let's just trace this back so I know where it's coming from. So Congress facade, member by last name. Oops. Member by last name is what it calls. This is kind of a funky refactor because then this calls members by last name, which then calls all Senate members. You can put caching at any point of this. Again, it's just important to remember that like if you have a helper method, like in this case, you could think of like Senate member as its own, that's a pull row that we're creating. If we were to like cache the return value here from a Senate for a specific last name, then it would be specific for that last name if we named the cache appropriately and uniquely enough. But if we ever changed Senate member without updating the cache, like if we ever changed what we stored in Senate member, the cache wouldn't know about that. So you got to make sure that you're like leaving notes for their developers and also taking care of that caching. Sorry that my dog's drinking and it's distracting me. I don't know if y'all can hear that. Yeah, so that's just something to be aware of. But I think for the sake of just showing this example, I'm going to take a look at this fetch Senate members, this call to our API, and that's in our Congress service. Fetch Senate members, and just take a look at caching this. So this isn't specific to any user input or anything like that. So I don't need to be too unique with this name. I don't need to interpolate anything at this point. But when we are caching data that comes from an API, or just caching data from a return value on our backend, we want to use fetch. Fetch is something that allows you to both write to the cache as well as read from it if that key has already been set in your cache. So syntax for this is rails.cache.fetch, and then you can name it here. So I'll say like Senate member search results, search JSON, sure. And wrap this in that cache. I'm going to put a pry in here just so we can see like how many times we hit this. And what are we at? Rails.cache.clear. And let's go ahead and fetch a Senate member. All right, so Senator is Warren. We hit our pry right here. We can see we hit it once. If I exit out of it, and then even if I try to go to a different senator, gosh, let's see, put the char. Did I spell that right? Cool. I didn't hit the pry. It cached the JSON response. I didn't go into it. But the syntax for this is a little different if you're going to be using that fragment caching, or if you're going to be using fragment caching from the view, or if you're going to be fetching, which will write and read the cache data on your backend. So these are the two. I kind of like chose these because I feel like for this project, if you wanted to implement caching, I think these are the two like caching techniques that would be most useful for you currently in your project. If you want to try out some other things such as like page caching, action caching, you're more than welcome to take a look at that. Again, you will need some extra, I think you need an extra gem for both of them. Questions? Did any questions pop up now after going through this example? All right, Aiden.
You explained the fetch a little bit more, the catch.fetch.
Yeah, thanks. Let me put a, do I want to do that? I don't think I need to. Okay, yeah, so this fetch, I think we can think of it similarly to what's happening with this cache do block. What the fetch is doing is it's saying, go find this key in our cache memory where we're storing all of this. And if you can find the key, then go ahead and serve up that cache data. If you can't find it, go ahead and write this data to the cache under this key with this key name. So that way, with the next time that we call this fetch Senate members, we can say, oh, is this Senate member search JSON? Is that a key in my cache memory? And we could say, yes, it is. So then it wouldn't even go into this do block, which is why we didn't hit the pry the second time we searched for a Senate member, which is the same thing that's happening over here with like, okay, the first time we render this view for a specific state, it's going to say, is the House members, let's say Alabama, House members for Alabama, is that a key in my cache? No, then let's go ahead and create a key that's House members for Alabama with this value, this data. And then the next time that you try to go to Alabama's page, it's going to say, is that House members Alabama key present in the cache? Yes, then go ahead and serve up that data. It won't even go into this block. Claudia, or Aiden, sorry, did you have a follow-up?
I guess just when you would use one syntax over the other, if they're doing very similar things.
Yeah, and they really are. This is just like view syntax. When you're caching something right in the view versus if you're not in a view, you can use this Rails cache fetch. That's
Thank
the
you.
difference. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Claudia?
Yeah, I was wondering, because I kind of forgot from our lesson maybe earlier in the mod, on cookies, but is there a limitation on how much like data you can cache?
Yeah, I think by default, take a look at this in development. I don't know if it says it. So this is the cache store in development that we're using. By default, Rails is using this memory store for the cache. And I think by default it's 32 gigabytes. If you wanted to change the size on it, I think you just like have to change the syntax here to whatever, sorry, megabytes to whatever you want it to be. I don't know exactly the syntax for that, but you can change the size of it. By default, I think it's 32 megabytes. All right, y'all, 1 hour, this goes quick. I want y'all to practice this. I know we have 11 minutes left. In the slides that I sent you, I put this, slide 7. I'm gonna let you all work on your own. We did this similar before, just like I'm gonna open up a bunch of breakout rooms to put you all in them. So you'll be in your own breakout room. If you want to choice into another breakout room to work with someone, you can, or just talk through it, you can. But I will push this branch up so you can also take a look at it. And I want you to try implementing fragment caching for the Senate search by last name view. And if you also have time, see if you can implement low-level caching for fetching house members. I put these little commands to remember down here. This Rails dev cache, I don't think I mentioned this, but by default, your development environment does not have caching turned on. And reason for that is so that we can like make a change while our server's still running and see that change right away. So by default, caching isn't turned on, but to turn caching on in development, you can run this and it'll toggle whether it's on or off. So you want to make sure it's on. It'll output a message saying it's on. And then this is what I've been using to be able to look at the data. Questions? Sorry, we're running so quick. All right. Great. Okay, I'm going to set it for 10 minutes, but I'll probably pull you back a little before. All right, looks like we have everyone back. I keep saying how quick this class is, but I hope my main goal with this class and our main goal with this class is to have like its title, an intro to caching. So hoping that this gives you some ideas going forward with possible ways that you can cache. Maybe you'll even have some ideas thinking about your current project on what you can do to kind of speed up your app and also just practice caching as well. So this is not something, just to kind of like reiterate, it's not something that is required. I know in the rubric it mentions like caching or memoization. Y'all know how to memoize. You're already using memoization, I'm sure, in your application somewhere. But it would be like a fun stretch goal to implement if you don't have enough stretch goals already, which I'm sure you do. I know that it's at 12 o'clock. What I'd like to do is, if y'all have to leave, feel free to jump off. I'm going to keep recording this. So if you want to come back to the questions, you can. But I want to make sure that if people have questions right now that they get those answered. So is there anything that after spending 10 minutes trying to see what you can do with caching, or even just like thinking over this last hour, any questions that are coming up right now?
I have a question.
Ryan, go ahead.
I haven't had a chance to dig into like what Tim said about the request persisting, but just in that, I only had time to do that first thing you showed. It seems that information is persisting across requests. Like, right, so I search for Sanders, I get Bernie Sanders. Then I go back to localhost 3000, I search for someone new and I get Sanders again. Am I missing something? I'm just curious if I'm missing a step.
What is confusing you? What's like the confusing piece of what you just said?
Are we, is that how the exercise is designed? Are we designed to get the same, like, is it showing us that like, okay, you searched for someone with the search functionality and caching is saving the result of your search. So when you go search for somebody else, you're getting the incorrect result.
Okay, so with that example, you'd have to be careful with how you are storing your cache as far as the name goes. You want to make sure it's specific to the data that you are storing. So if you were to store it just as like Senate member, let me share my screen. If you were to store Senate, search for last name. If you were to store this whole thing as Senate member instead of something a little bit more specific, let me just grab this for sake of convenience.
Are you meant to be sharing, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, can you not see it? Oh, I didn't even fully click share. Can you see it now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, so if you were to cache this, I just copied this from the last one. Let me take this off for now. And you were to say like, let's cache this with the name of Senate member. If you were to do this, anytime that this page gets rendered to any user, it would, like, if you first searched for Bernie Sanders, that cached value of this template, like what this evaluates to, that would get sent back with the request instead of looking up a specific senator's information. So that's why this needs to be specific, because what would happen is like, okay, you search for Sanders, and so it's like, okay, well, is this key defined? No. Let me go ahead and define that for Sanders. And then the next time you go and you put in Klobuchar, it's like, okay, is this key already stored in my cache? Yes, but it just so happens to be that that data is for Bernie Sanders. So if you are going to be caching, you got to make sure that the name of your cache is specific to what you're caching. So in this case, what do we have available to us? We have a member. So we could do something. It would be a little bit easier if we like had these as actual senators stored in our database, because then we'd have unique IDs. But in our case, we just have access to a member right now. So we could do something like @member.last name. And then that would be served up anytime someone went to Sanders site, Sanders page. Does that make sense, Ryan?
Yeah, and I actually, while you're talking, I just did it in the, yeah, I guess I saw that when you showed in the views, but it didn't translate over to wrapping that method with the last name. So yeah, I just did string interpolation and put the last name parameter, and then it worked correctly.
Cool, gotcha. Thanks. Any other questions that came up or thoughts, curiosities?
I was looking through some of the documentation links, and in most of the examples for fragment caching, they put the cache is like below the, yeah, like in this one, they put it below kind of like the iteration blocks. I guess, is there like a preference to that? Because I guess if you think about it like that, iteration block only renders if there's data to render. So it probably doesn't really matter if it's outside or within. But then I was like, well, I guess there's like a component of like the code is activating the products.each. So I was like, I don't know, I got into this weird performance thought where I was like, the way you did it would essentially say like, don't even run this block of code. And this one attempts to run the block of code and would check for a cache.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to, I think you brought up this question before of just like, could we attach it to a model object or something that's stored in our database? And the pro of this, like, I didn't do this in mine because I'm just working with POROs anyway, and I wouldn't know when they get updated. But attaching the cache to a specific object that's stored in your database allows it so that if the product were to be updated, so this, okay, let's pull this up. there's like a few different things that happen with these names. If there isn't an attached, I believe this is how it happens, or at least this is my understanding of it right now. If it's not attached to an object stored in your database, then this hash digest is based off of the view, or based off of like the data that's generated for that cache. But if it's associated with an object that's stored in your database, it's actually a combination of the ID of that object and the updated at. So if that updated at ever changes, then it would invalidate that cache for that specific product in this case, and get that information for that product. So in this case, if product is stored in our database, this would be the way to go, so that if any particular project or product got updated, then that we could go ahead and invalidate that specific product cache and redo it.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, this is like definitely a new topic, and there's like so many different techniques for this as well. So yeah, this is, oh, I realized, oh yeah, I'm still sharing my screen. But yeah, if you're able to bind it to an object, do that, because then Rails can take care of that invalidation for you.
Gotcha. Okay.
I had just a quick question on that syntax. Why do they have render product and why don't they just have product only?
There is some, I think with, gosh, I'd have to look into this again.
Oh, yeah, no worries.
There is
It's
something that
not
Rails
enough
is doing under the hood with this to be able to figure out which view it is that it's rendering. Yeah, I think it's maybe the view for this is called render. Maybe it's within a product action. I'm not entirely sure on that. I have to look into that a little more on that specific syntax.
I guess one random other question too, like as I was scrolling through the docs, is there like anything you can't cache? Because they're like even like caching like partials, which is kind of like a whole view, which is, I'm assuming, different than like a page cache because it's like a component of a page. But is there like a type of like objects that can't be cached and or should not be cached, I guess?
I think I just keep thinking back to like, if something is going to get updated frequently, then you wouldn't want to cache it. But I think with the different techniques that are available to you for caching, I think you could cache most things. The only thing that I would say like you have to be careful of is with page caching. Page caching that won't even hit your controller. It'll just serve up the page that was cached. So if you ever have like a before filter that you need to hit in order to know if you can render a certain template, then you would use, I think you would use action. I think you would use action caching, because action caching allows you to hit the before action and then serve up the view. So there's certain like nuances there of just like, okay, don't cache the whole page if there's a before filter you need to hit, but instead you can use a different caching technique. So there's like different ways around how to cache.
Very cool.
Yeah. Anything else? All great questions. We go for like 3 hours.
It feels like it's a Russian nesting doll. I'm just kidding, because that's the thing below the fragment. It's Russian nesting doll caching.
Yeah, Russian nesting doll is, I mean, it's useful when you have, again, when you have like those objects stored in your database. All it is I think you just put like a little something on the model. It's like touch, yeah. And what that does is it's saying like, if we have something cached that uses this game object, then make sure that you are validating the cache again. Like, yeah, if a game object is used within a cache, then invalidate the cache if it's updated, something like that. Yeah, it's definitely helpful when you have that like different levels of caching happening.
It kind of brings up my original curiosity, which is like, if we're in mod 4 and we're paired with a front end group, like, are they going to be driving us on, hey, we want to cache this, and this, so we have to like look at it from their needs? Or are we going to be suggesting to them like, hey, my API is doing XYZ, this is how you should be caching, or is that how the conversation even goes?
I think it will look different depending on what exactly your backend is doing and what exactly their front end is doing. Like they are able to cache on their end as well. And so they might choose to cache client side for things that they want to reach too quickly that the backend doesn't necessarily need. Yeah, I think it would be a conversation of like, this is the information we need from the backend. And if it was something that took a lot of time or was expensive in some way, then you would cache that. There are, yeah, you would have to communicate that. I was about to go down a tangent rabbit hole.
Yeah, because I was
But
just
yeah,
thinking about our project. Like our project uses a calendar, and like a calendar uses a singular object called events, which is an array of things. But like, let's say the user updates a singular event in the events array, then it kind of goes to like this type of this partial caching where it's like, well, we don't really need to update every event in your whole entire calendar. We just need to update a singular event. So in that case, it's like you have that Russian doll caching where it's saying, okay, go to the server and grab the single new event update and then render it in the view.
Are those, when your user updates an event, is that specific for that user's event?
Right, like, so, well, I'm thinking that like if the front end just has a cached collection of events that they're displaying on a calendar gem, and let's say the user says, I want to cancel my date next Friday. And so when they do that, that sends a post request to the backend API. Well, then the front end will have essentially an object, which is an array that will be out of date with the actual API collection. So in that sense, they could, like, they would have one element in the whole entire array that would be out of like sync. So in that case, they would just update a singular item. And
I think
guess
that would be more on the client side, since it's more specific to that user. Because like what you're saying is like, what if the user deleted an event from their calendar? You'd want to know about that from the backend, but you wouldn't want to delete that event from everyone's calendar. Like when we're talking about, like, currently we're talking about caching in Rails, it's talking about like storing that information on the server side for anyone. So since like that, in that instance, that example, I think that's more specific to a specific user. And if you wanted to like cache information on the calendar on the front end to say like, oh, this is the information that this user has currently available to them, then I think that would be more the front end side, which, to be honest, I'm not too familiar with the client side caching, but I wouldn't imagine that you would use the back end caching for that.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right,
Thank you.
great questions. Yeah, of course. I'm glad some people took me up and stayed for a little bit. Appreciate it. And yeah, cool. I'll go ahead and wrap this up and get this posted so y'all can come back and take a look at it too. But have a good lunch and we'll see y'all later.
Thank you, Meg.
See ya.